what had once been the old Federalist Party basically had all but dissolved after they had been blamed for treason after the War of 1812. And you had the preeminence of the Republican Party. Back then, you had the Democratic Republican Party in its full name. And in the era of good feelings, basically, it was the only party and it was really strong. But in the 1820s, in the aftermath of the Panic of 1819, and then the Missouri Compromise, and then other things that would eventually happen leading up to the election of 1824, it was pretty obvious that the Democratic Republican Party was in fact really starting to splinter. You have four distinct candidates in the presidential election of 1824. You had William Crawford of Georgia, the states' rights guy. You had Henry Clay, who was the American system guy, who believed in the idea of creating a home market for factory workers and agriculture and protective tariffs, a strong national bank, financing internal improvements. You have Andrew Jackson, who was the hero of the War of 1812 and the Seminole Wars, had little to no experience in politics, even though he had been elected to the Senate in a couple years prior. And then, of course, you have John Quincy Adams, the son of former President John Adams from Massachusetts. And they each had differences politically. And the Republican Party's official name was the Democratic Republican Party. They would eventually become split into two parties. And in 1824, you have various different electors that didn't carry majorities. Andrew Jackson actually received the most electoral votes, but because there was no clear-cut winner with a clear-cut majority, there would need to be a vote among House of Representatives from each state all across the country. So in 1824, eventually, you have John Adams make an agreement with one of the other presidential candidates, Henry Clay, who also happened to be Speaker of the House at the time. And since he was Speaker of the House, he wielded influence. John Quincy Adams actually approached Henry Clay and said, hey, if you bow out and if you support my cause, I will name you a Secretary of State. In effect, if you've given American presidential history to that point, that's kind of now the person who's probably going to become the next president. So essentially, Henry Clay's like, I see that offer, and I'll take it. I'll be your Secretary of State because I'll probably be president after you. I can deal with that. So Henry Clay does that. And the House, along with his influence and that corrupt bargain that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay make, eventually puts John Quincy Adams in the White House. And that incenses people who supported Andrew Jackson. It was a corrupt bargain. And then, of course, since they saw that Henry Clay became the Secretary of State, now that would just incense Jackson's supporters even further. And John Quincy Adams as president was very weak. He was not a very likable guy. He was not very charismatic. You look at modern American presidents, Barack Obama, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, they were all very charismatic. They had this speaking ability to engage and this just effectual charisma that just oozed from them. And they connected to people, even those they disagreed with. John Quincy Adams had zero of that. Okay? And he was just not a likable guy. And he would try and buddy up to some of these Latin American countries and impose various different tariffs that would in turn hurt American producers. He became this very unpopular president. So in 1828, Andrew Jackson would run against him. Andrew Jackson, now you have a more formal split within the Republican Party. The Democratic Republican Party would basically become the Democrat Party, and the Republicans who would eventually give way to becoming the Whig Party. Okay? The Republican Party of this era is not the same as the Republican Party of today. Today's Republican Party, the Grand Old Party, was the party of Lincoln. It It was established in the 1850s, which is a good 20, 30 years after this time frame in American history. So the modern day Republican Party is Lincoln's party, the GOP. Okay? The Republican Party of the era that we're talking about is an old extension of the old Democrat Party, or Republican Party, as opposition to Federalists. Okay? Otherwise, though, Andrew Jackson, with all of his luster, even though he had a limited amount of political experience, was very popular in American society, especially in the South. He was a Southerner. He was from Tennessee. People liked that he was more reminiscent of a common man. Okay? We're going to talk about him in the next chapter and who he might represent. Okay? Otherwise, though, Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams would vie for the presidency, and Andrew Jackson appealed to people who opposed economic aristocracies. He opposed, those who came from wealth and privilege. The common guy. He's going to fight for you. Okay? So Adams basically attracted support from your old school Federalists back in the day. Those who wanted a stronger centralized government. Whereas Andrew Jackson's Democrat appeal had more of like an old Jeffersonian appeal. Lesser government. More of a rural authority. That sort of thing. Appeal to commoners. Wonder where we've seen that in modern American history. Okay? You may want to think about that. Otherwise, though, various other different things happen, but in 1828, Andrew Jackson handily wins the American presidency against a very unpopular John Quincy Adams. And there would be a new era of the American common man ushered in by President Andrew Jackson.